The great thing about the strategy Petrosian uses in this game is that anybody can do it. It works in every game, and it requires no calculation whatsoever. Really an effective way to play good chess. So let's watch this game from Petrosian. He's playing against international master Hilar Karner in this game, and watch this technique. And the technique is very simple. You just compare your pieces to your opponent's pieces and make sure your pieces are better placed. Watch how Petrosian does that in this game. He has white, Karner has black. He begins with d4, knight f6, c4, d6, knight c3, g6, a King's Indian formation, e4, bishop g7, and f3, the Samish or Zamish system, where white creates this strong pawn structure with e4 well defended. The only downside is this pawn does take away the natural developing square for the knight. Other than that, this is a very nice structure for white. Black attacks it with c5. Usually black castles first before playing c5. But here they play c5 immediately, attacking the most sensitive square in Petrosian's position, the d4 square, the d4 pawn. But the reason they usually castle first is because of what Petrosian plays here. He takes on c5. After pawn takes, he exchanges queens. And in this position, black is still okay. But now we begin to see, in a simple formation, how Petrosian uses his pieces, puts his pieces in better places than his opponent's pieces. First, bishop to g5, which is a little strange because you'd usually want that bishop on e3 to help control d4. Petrosian puts it on g5 to pressure the knight at f6. The knight goes to d7, unleashing the bishop on g7. f4 is played by white, and here probably black's best move was to take the knight and cripple the queenside pawn structure. But giving up a nice dark squared bishop like that is not easy to do, and black does not do it. He plays knight to c6, aiming at this very sensitive d4 square. Knight f3, knight d4, and long castle. The threat from white is to play e5, blocking the bishop's defense of the knight, and then take on d4. So black goes ahead and takes on f3, gf3, and yes, there are some pawn weaknesses here, but they also control a lot of key squares. And we can begin the piece comparison mode of this position. Notice how white's rooks are in much better position already on the one open file. And white has access to this d5 square at the moment. f6 blocks the bishop out. Again, still probably bishop takes knight was the better idea, ruining white's queenside pawn structure. But he plays f6 and bishop to h4. So we can already begin to compare the pieces. Notice black's bishop is blocked by its own pawn, and white has a very good rook on the open file. King to e8, stepping out of the pin. Bishop to h3. Now that these light squares are weak, the bishop goes to h3. He anticipates it's going to be traded off, which it is, after knight b6. The knight attacks c4, but bishop takes bishop, rook takes, and now b3 to defend this pawn. And look at the knight. This knight is much better placed. It has potential access to d5. This knight at b6 can't do much on the square that it is on right now. Bishop to h6, attacking the sensitive f4 pawn. Knight to e2 defends it. King to f7, king to c2, rook h to d8, and now bishop to f2. So Petrosian is fighting for control of this d file, but he knows his opponent isn't just going to give it up for free. So by putting the bishop on f2, he's putting pressure on c5. So he's threatening to take and then win the c5 pawn. And by putting pressure on c5, he's able to get control of the d file. Rook takes d1, rook takes d1, and now Petrosian controls the d file. His rook is better than his opponent's rook because that pawn has to be defended. Black plays f5. He wants to put his pawns on light squares because his bishop is on dark squares. He wants to fix this f4 weakness so he can target it. So he plays f5. If white responds with e5, it's playable, but it gains space. But now these pawns become fixed and weak, and the dark squared bishop can attack them. So Petrosian prefers to keep flexibility in his structure. Plays bishop to e3, king to e8, and now h4, target consciousness. He's creating a target on the king side. He wants to play h5 and then move the rook over and penetrate down the h file. Again, this is how he keeps his pieces better. His strategy is this. He wants to open up the h file control it, and then deny black any entry points along the d file. So he's going to give black the d file, but then make it pointless because there will be no place for his rook to get into the position. So knight to d7, which really needs to be played because black needs to free this rook, and he has to defend this pawn at c5. So the knight moves to keep that pawn defended. h5, continuing his pressure on the king side to create a weakness. Bishop to f8. By the way, taking that pawn would be a terrible move. It would wreck his pawn structure. After rook to h1, he's going to get the pawn back, and white is just clearly better in that position. So bishop to f8 from black. He wants to play e6 and let the bishop defend c5. Rook to h1, continuing that idea of making his rook better than black's rook. Rook to c6, defending laterally. Knight to g3. And here, probably the natural e6 is as good as anything, maybe the best move. But he plays rook to e6, creating a pin on the e file. He probably wants white to go ahead and play e5, but Petrosian does not do that. He takes on g6, hg6. Now, compare the rooks. This rook on e6 is awkwardly placed, and Petrosian comfortably controls the h file. Now, bishop to d2, stepping out of the pin, and now threatening to take on f5. The rook moves to a6 to hit a2, a4, e6, and bishop to c3. Now, let's compare the pieces. The white's rook is obviously better than black's rook, which isn't accomplishing much of anything. Petrosian's bishop controls this nice long diagonal compared to the bishop at f8, which is much less effective. Now, Petrosian, though, has one badly placed piece, and we now know what that is by process of elimination. This knight on g3 is not very well placed. So what does he do? He immediately begins to make the third piece better than his opponent's piece on d7. He plays, well, black plays rook to c6 first to get it activated. By the way, if he plays rook to d6, notice there are no penetration points on the file. That's why he doesn't play the rook to d6. That's Petrosian's idea. Rook to c6, now knight to e2, beginning its journey. Where is it going? Rook to c8, knight to c1. Now, he plays b6 here. Turns out, computer showed the most precise move was bishop to d6, with the idea that if he plays rook to h7, black would just take the pawn, and if he plays rook to h8 check, then knight to f8 keeps the rook out of h7, and black looks like he can fight on in that position. But he plays b6, knight to d3, and now compare every single piece with black's counterparts. All three are better across the board. No calculation, just better pieces. Simple as that. Rook to d8, now rook to h7. He has access to that square now. He's aiming at the a7 pawn. The knight's blocking, but a5. And this does defend that pawn, but it also places all of these pawns on dark squares, which Petrosian's bishop will be able to attack. King to d2, centralizing the king. The king's a piece too. He wants that to be better also. Bishop to e7, king to e3, and g5. And here computers show a really strong idea for white. Very hard for any human to see. But it was the move pawn takes f5 with this idea. Rook to h5. And this lateral pressure is really strong. After pawn takes, notice again, black's rook would be denied any entry points along the d file. And black would have to prevent, I mean, white's just going to take this pawn at f5. So black would have to give up his two minor pieces for the rook with this mini combination of bishop to h4 aiming at the knight, which couldn't move because he has to keep the rook out. And then rook takes, then the fork. But in this position, white is just winning because he's just going to get that f5 pawn, and he will just win with this extra pawn. The rook can't compete with the pawn and the two minors. But Petrosian also plays a good move. Rook to g7, pawn takes e4, king takes e4, and this was black's last chance to stay in the game. He could have played knight to f6 check. After bishop takes knight, bishop takes, rook g8 check, getting the rooks off, pawn takes, and in this endgame, black can probably hold. It's not easy, but he can probably keep the king and knight out there. But instead, he plays bishop to f6, and that allows Petrosian to create the minor piece endgame we just saw with this intermediate move, rook takes d7, undermining the bishop at f6. If rook takes d7, bishop takes f6, and this minor piece endgame is winning for Petrosian. So his opponent took the bishop instead, but after rook d8, king d8, pawn takes, now that endgame, he has this extra g-pawn, making it an easy win. And in this position, Karner resigned and Petrosian won. No violent attacks, no deep, complex calculation, just are my pieces better than my opponent's pieces? That was the fight the whole time until in the end, Black's position collapsed. I hope you enjoyed this strategic masterpiece from Tigran Petrosian. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.